Imagine this. You're walking into a job interview. You've prepared, you've rehearsed, you know your answers. But deep down, you're nervous. You keep thinking, I'm probably going to mess this up. You sit across from the interviewer, and sure enough, your voice shakes, your hands sweat, your mind blanks. By the end, you walk out convinced you were right. You failed because you weren't good enough. But what if that wasn't the real reason? What if it wasn't the questions or the interviewer or even your resume? What if it was the way you looked at the situation that created the outcome? Think about how often this happens in daily life. You enter a new relationship, already worried it won't last, and before long, the very fear of abandonment starts shaping your behavior, clinginess, mistrust, hesitation, until the relationship collapses under the weight of your expectation. You walk away saying, "See, I knew it would happen." But maybe it didn't happen because it was destined to. Maybe it happened because your attention scripted it into being. This is the unsettling idea behind the observer effect. In quantum physics, the act of observation changes what is being observed. Particles behave like waves when no one is looking, but the moment you measure them, they collapse into something solid, something specific. Reality itself shifts depending on how it's observed. Now imagine applying that idea to your own life. Every day you're observing reality, not with microscopes or lab equipment, but with your thoughts, your beliefs, your fears, and your desires. And just like in the lab, reality bends in response. It takes the shape of your observation. It collapses into a version of the world that proves your expectations true. This is why so many people feel trapped in a loop. They think they're just watching life unfold, powerless to change it. But in truth, they're not passive observers. They're active participants, unknowingly co-creating every outcome by the lens through which they see it. And here's the great question. If the way you look at reality is secretly shaping it, then how much of your life is truly real, and how much is just the echo of your own perception? If the observer effect is not just a principle of physics, but a principle of existence, then your world is not as solid as it seems. It's not fixed, it's fluid. It's not written, it's being written, moment by moment, through the frequency of your attention. Which leads us to the haunting possibility. You've been creating your world all along, without even realizing it. The fears you hold, the expectations you cling to, the stories you repeat in your head, these are not just thoughts, they are instructions, and reality, like a faithful mirror, obeys. So the question is not whether you have the power to shift reality. The question is, will you keep looking through the same lens or dare to see differently? So, let's look closer at the hidden engine driving this cycle. Why does it feel like no matter what you do, life keeps confirming your worst fears, your deepest doubts, your private insecurities? Psychology has been pointing to this for decades. There's something called confirmation bias, the brain's tendency to seek out evidence for what it already believes. If you think people can't be trusted, you'll notice every little sign of betrayal while ignoring every act of loyalty. If you think you're not worthy, you'll magnify every rejection while brushing off every success. It's not that reality is objective, it's that your perception filters it before you even see it. Then there's the self-fulfilling prophecy. Teachers who expect certain students to fail often treat them differently. Less encouragement, less patience, and the students end up performing exactly as predicted. The prophecy becomes reality, not because it was true to begin with, but because someone believed it was. In relationships, the same thing happens. Fear of abandonment leads to behaviors that push people away. Expectation of rejection makes you defensive, cold, or overly needy. In the end, you prove yourself right, not because life forced it, but because your attention shaped it. And here's where it gets darker. Most of these observations aren't conscious. They come from the subconscious mind, old experiences, unresolved wounds, shadow beliefs formed years ago. Imagine your childhood taught you that love is conditional, or that achievement is the only way to feel safe. Those old impressions don't just vanish. They live inside you, shaping the way you observe reality every single day. And because observation is creation, those subconscious patterns become self-reinforcing loops. Think about American dating culture for a moment. You swipe through apps like Tinder or Bumble with the thought, everyone here just wants something shallow. What happens? You notice the matches who ghost you, who don't text back, who treat you casually, and you ignore the ones who might have been different. The app becomes a mirror of your observation. The more you expect shallowness, the more shallow it appears. Or take workplace culture. If you enter a new job already bracing for burnout, already convinced that every boss is toxic, what happens? You focus on the long hours, the unfair demands, the stressful meetings. And because that's where your energy goes, that becomes your experience. It's not that the job had to be toxic, it's that your lens shaped it into that form. These are the hidden roots of the observer effect in everyday life. You think you're watching reality, but you're actually scripting it. You think you're simply describing, but you're prescribing. Your focus doesn't just color your experience, it collapses it, narrows it, makes it solid. And so the loop continues. Now here's the real trap. Because the results feel real, you assume your perception must have been accurate. You fail an interview and you say, "See, I was never good enough." You get ghosted on a dating app, and you say, "See, nobody takes me seriously." You burn out in another office and you say, "See, every job is the same." And each time you repeat this story, your observation digs deeper, tuning your frequency even tighter to the reality you already fear. It becomes a cycle so tight, so invisible, that you no longer see it as a cycle. You call it truth. You call it the way things are. But what if it isn't? What if your so-called truth is just the echo of your observation? What if your world has been shrinking around the lens of your attention, while countless other possibilities exist just outside of view? That's the hidden problem. You don't just live in reality. You live in the version of reality your mind allows you to see. And until you recognize that, you'll keep mistaking your observation for fact, when in fact it's creation. So the real question becomes, if your attention has been secretly shaping your world all along, how do you take back control of the lens? Now let's take this to a deeper level. Up until now, everything I've said could be explained through psychology, biases, self-fulfilling prophecies, subconscious patterns. But what if the roots of this mystery go beyond the mind? What if the act of observation itself is wired into the very fabric of reality? This is the unsettling lesson from quantum physics. In the early 20th century, physicists conducted experiments on electrons and photons, tiny building blocks of the universe. They discovered something bizarre. When particles weren't being observed, they behaved like waves, spread out in all directions, existing in multiple possibilities at once. But the moment someone measured or observed them, the wave collapsed. The particle chose a definite position. Think about that for a second. Observation didn't just record reality, it changed it. The very act of looking altered what was there. This is known as the observer effect. Now, physicists might argue over the interpretation, but the principle remains. Reality doesn't show up the same way when it's unobserved versus when it is observed. In other words, the universe is not a fixed, solid machine. It is fluid, flexible, and strangely responsive to the act of attention. And here's where the connection gets mind-bending. Because what are you doing every moment of your life, if not observing? Every glance, every thought, every expectation is a form of observation. And just like the particles in those experiments, your reality collapses around the lens through which you look. It's almost as if life itself is a hologram. Imagine a holographic projection. The image shifts depending on where you stand, how you look at it, what angle you bring. The object doesn't change, but your perspective collapses one version of it into your experience. Reality is the same. Countless possibilities exist, but you only experience the one you're tuned to by your observation. Let me give you an everyday metaphor. Imagine you're wearing colored glasses. If your lenses are tinted red, the whole world looks red. If they're tinted blue, the world looks blue. You might insist the world is that color, but really, it's your lens shaping the perception. The observer effect suggests that your inner lens isn't just coloring reality, it's participating in creating it. That's why two people can go through the exact same event and live two entirely different realities. One person sees failure as a sign of unworthiness, another sees it as feedback to grow. One collapses reality into shame, the other collapses it into resilience. The event didn't decide for them, their observation did. And if reality is this responsive, then the repeating patterns we see in life start to make sense. You don't just notice the same struggles. You create conditions that collapse into those struggles. If you observe life through fear, reality answers with proof to justify it. If you observe life through expectation of betrayal, reality collapses into forms that confirm it. The loop continues, not because fate demands it, but because your lens directs it. This is why the concept of a reality shift is so powerful. Shifting reality doesn't mean you physically leap into another universe. It means you shift the frequency of your observation. You look at life differently, and reality responds differently. Change the lens, and you change the collapse. Change the observation, and you change the outcome. Let's pause on that for a moment, because if this is true, then your attention is not passive. It is active. Every time you tell yourself, "I always fail," you're not just describing reality, you're instructing it. Every time you think, "People always leave," you're not just voicing fear, you're collapsing possibilities into abandonment. Every thought is a measurement, every focus is an experiment, every lens is a collapse. And if that's the case, then the most important decision you'll ever make isn't what job to take, what city to live in, or even who to love. The most important decision is, what lens will I observe through? This changes everything, because it means you're not doomed by circumstance. You're empowered by consciousness. It means you don't just live in reality. You live in the version of reality your observation keeps choosing. So here's the radical insight. If you've been secretly creating your world through the observer effect all along, then you're not a prisoner of reality. You're a participant in it. And if you want to step into a new life, you don't have to wait for luck or fate or chance. You simply have to shift the way you observe. And that leads us to the next question. If you're the observer, if you're the one collapsing possibility into form, then what are you going to choose to see? Up to this point, it may feel like reality is playing tricks on you. As if you've been caught in a web you didn't spin, repeating the same struggles, watching life collapse into the same shapes again and again. But here's the turning point. The very principle that traps you is also the principle that can set you free. If observation collapses reality, then you are not just a watcher. You are the architect. You don't merely describe the world. You participate in producing it. And this is where rebellion begins. Most people never realize this. They move through life blaming circumstances, blaming their past, blaming luck. I didn't get the job because the economy is bad. I can't find love because everyone out there is shallow. I'm burned out because the world is unfair. Each of these stories feels safe because it lets us off the hook. If the world is to blame, then we don't have to change. But here's the hard truth. The world has been mirroring your observation all along, which means the rebellion is not against society, or fate, or destiny. The rebellion is against your own lens. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." At first, that sounds extreme. Surely some things are just the way they are, right? But the more you look, the more you realize, interpretation is everything. It decides whether failure becomes shame or growth, whether loss becomes despair or renewal, whether a moment becomes a wall or a doorway. And if interpretation is observation, and observation shapes reality, then Nietzsche wasn't exaggerating at all. He was pointing to the same truth that quantum physics now reveals. Your perspective is not neutral. It is creative. Think of how radical this is. It means every story you've told yourself about your worth, your relationships, your career, isn't just a description. It's a broadcast. And reality, like a loyal mirror, sends the signal back. This is why the rebellion is so uncomfortable. Because once you accept this, you can't hide behind excuses anymore. You can't keep saying, "That's just how life works." You have to admit that life is reflecting you. And that means you can no longer afford to treat your thoughts, your focus, your lens as if they're powerless. The rebellion is not external, it's internal. It begins the moment you refuse to observe through the same old filter. It begins the moment you say, "No, I will not keep collapsing reality into the same loop. I will choose a new lens." But rebellion isn't just a shift in thinking, it's a shift in identity. Because when you stop being a passive observer and start being a conscious participant, you reclaim a power you've been ignoring all your life. You realize you're not condemned to repeat, you're invited to create. Of course, with power comes responsibility. Once you see yourself as the transmitter, the creator, the lens through which reality collapses, you can't simply blame the world anymore. And that can feel terrifying. Freedom always does. As Sartre said, man is condemned to be free. Condemned because we cannot escape responsibility. Free because within that responsibility lies the power to change everything. So let me ask you, what would happen if you stopped blaming? What would happen if you stopped saying, "That's just who I am," and instead asked, "What lens am I choosing today?" This is the heart of rebellion, not against others, not against society, but against the unconscious habits of observation that have kept you stuck. And here's the beautiful irony. The moment you stop collapsing reality through fear, through scarcity, through doubt, the moment you dare to observe with a new lens, you don't just see differently. Reality responds differently. Doors you thought were locked start to open. People you thought didn't exist start to appear. Energy you thought was gone returns. Because life was never fixed. It was always waiting for you to choose how to look at it. So the question is no longer, why does life keep repeating? The real question is, what reality do you dare to collapse into being? So now we've arrived at the ultimate truth. Reality isn't something happening to you. Reality is something collapsing through you. The observer effect doesn't just exist in physics labs, it exists in your daily life. And if observation shapes reality, then the lens you choose is the most powerful tool you'll ever own. But knowledge alone won't break the loop. You need practice. You need a way to shift the way you observe, not just once in theory, but over and over until it becomes natural. Here's a simple ritual I call the observer shift practice. It takes only 5 minutes, but if you do it daily, you'll begin to notice subtle changes in how the world responds. Each night, take a journal and write down one situation from your day that triggered you. Maybe stress at work, maybe tension in a relationship, maybe just a moment of self-doubt. Then ask yourself, how did I observe this? What lens did I use? Write the honest answer. Maybe you observed through fear. Maybe you observed through judgment. Maybe you observed through scarcity. Then take a deep breath, close your eyes, and imagine observing the exact same situation through a different lens. What would it look like if you observed it with curiosity instead of fear? With compassion instead of judgment? With abundance instead of scarcity? Visualize the scene shifting as you shift your observation. Finally, write one simple sentence. Tomorrow, I choose to observe through Ajuraya Chepawash. Fill in the blank with the new lens you want to bring. Patience, trust, openness, courage. That's it. 5 minutes. But in that small practice, you are retraining your consciousness to become an active participant, not a passive victim. You're reminding yourself that your attention isn't neutral, it's creative. And when you begin to live like this, something remarkable happens. Reality starts to feel lighter, less fixed, more fluid. You'll notice different details, different people, different opportunities, not because the world suddenly changed, but because you shifted the way you collapsed it. This is the essence of a reality shift. It's not magic. It's not about controlling everything outside of you. It's about reclaiming the lens inside of you. Because once you shift that, the external world has no choice but to respond. So tonight, I invite you to try this practice. Write down the loop. Name the lens. Imagine a new one. And tomorrow, watch closely. Notice how reality bends. Not in giant miracles, but in subtle, undeniable ways. Because in the end, the truth is simple. You don't just see reality, you create it.